what is going on in Bosnia is genocide, and the U.S. has a moral obligation to stop it. Can you tell us what you meant by that?
Well, to me it seems that if you add up what Serbs are doing in Bosnia, it is genocide. The Serbs are systematically eradicating every trace of what used to be Bosnian society, trying to fragment parts of it to incorporate Serbian elements of the former Bosnia into what they want as a larger Serbia. In the process, Serbs are killing tens of thousands of people, putting tens of thousands of people in concentration camps.
The interview you're about to see is with a man by the name of George Kenney. Until August 25th, 1992, George Kenney was chief of the Yugoslav Desk for the United States State Department. On that date, he resigned from both the State Department and from his position in the Foreign Service in protest of the American foreign policy towards Serbia and Serbian aggression in Bosnia Hercegovina and in Croatia. The interview was conducted on September 24th, 1992 in Washington, D.C. We hope you'll find it informative. Mr. Kenney, you resigned from the State Department on August 25th of this year. How long were you a member of the Foreign Service?
I was in the Foreign Service for about 4.5 years. I joined in April of 1988, and I served in Marseille, France, in Washington in the Economic Bureau dealing with oil and energy security issues during the Gulf War, then also in Kinshasa, Zaire, and most recently for about 7 months on the Yugoslav Desk.
Mm-hmm. And what was your title at the time of your resignation?
Formally, I was the deputy officer in charge for about 6 months, and then I was the acting officer in charge for Yugoslav affairs for the last month I was there. Generally, the position I held is referred to as desk officer. The desk officer for a country is the focal point for policy, for coordinating different kinds of activities. In fact, though, it's a mid-level position. It's not a senior policy-making position by any means, but I would prepare, for example, a briefing memorandum for the president when he went to summit meetings, or briefing memorandum or action memorandum for the deputy secretary or for other principal officers on the 7th floor when they needed to make decisions on different issues or when they were participating in meetings, that kind of thing. A lot of paperwork. I also worked quite intensively on public affairs. About a third of my job, I would say, involved writing press releases, writing statements for Margaret Tutwiler, and generally dealing with public affairs questions.
Would that be public affairs relating solely to Yugoslavia?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So we can say that that you kind of managed the day-to-day policy of the American government towards Yugoslavia, or what was
That's right, but again, it's important to understand that I wasn't in the position where I made the policy. Mm-hmm. I tried to carry it out, tried to articulate it for the administration, but I wasn't in a senior policy-making position.
Would you categorize yourself as an expert on the countries which were formerly part of Yugoslavia, for example, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia?
Not by training, no. In the pattern of most foreign service assignments, I came into the position without any knowledge, really, of the area. Mm-hmm. Just my general background as a professional diplomat. But after 7 months of working on these issues on a very intense basis, I feel that I have a good grasp of the situation.
Would it be fair to say then, if you're not an expert on what was formerly Yugoslavia, then you would be certainly an authority on the U.S. policy towards what
I would agree with that.
Okay. Mr. Kenney, why did you resign on August 25th from the State Department?
That's very simple. I believe that American policy towards Yugoslavia is wrong, is counterproductive, and should be changed. Within the administration, I didn't see any hope that I could change the policy. I felt that I was doing something wrong by continuing to support it, and I also believed that by resigning and speaking out publicly against the administration, there is some chance of affecting the policy. I know from my experience working on public affairs that the administration responds a great deal to public criticism. I must say that to date I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that the administration has really responded to my resignation. When I speak with my former colleagues, it sounds like things are going on in the usual way, with nothing getting done, with meetings that don't accomplish anything, with a lot of paper being produced that doesn't result in any real action. But still, I think that there's a hope that public opinion in the United States can be brought to bear more on these questions. I think that Americans are upset, are disturbed when they see pictures coming out of the former Yugoslavia documenting the horrible kinds of atrocities that are going on. And it doesn't really matter whether the average American understands what the conflict is about. Most Americans, I believe, couldn't find Yugoslavia on a map. Mm-hmm. But it's enough for them to see that these kinds of things are very, very wrong. And I think with political leadership, Americans would support an active role for the United States in the conflict. But it's going to be a difficult process to turn public opinion around, and it may take time. That's the problem. I think in 6 months or a year, people will understand enough about this conflict to want to force the administration, whatever administration it is, to do something. But by then, things will be much worse. The conflict won't have gone away, but the longer you wait in trying to seriously deal with it, the more difficult it is to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is your attempt to affect the American policy towards that area? Has that ended now with your resignation, or do you anticipate that continuing?
No. My resignation would be meaningless if I resigned and walked away from the question. The whole point is to affect the policy, and I don't intend to let the administration forget that it's making a lot of serious mistakes. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting to see what the public response to my resignation has been. A lot of people have asked me to come and speak before their groups. Quite a few people have asked me to write articles for them. I believe that this process will go on, that the public debate will continue, and it's a good thing to engage the administration in this, and may force the administration to question some of its assumptions. But fundamentally, I don't think that the administration really cares about the policy that it has towards Yugoslavia. It had decided early on that there was nothing to gain politically from being active, whereas there was a great risk in getting political criticism for being active in an area that's very far away, that's very complicated. Mm-hmm. If the administration were to revise its calculations to believe that it stood to gain politically from a more active policy, it would switch, and it could switch very quickly. But it's all political.
Are you surprised at all by the response towards your resignation by the news media? For example, there's been articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times. Are you surprised at all by the response?
Somewhat. I expected there to be interest. I expected to see a few news stories, but there's been continuing interest among very serious newspapers, and that's a good thing. If the administration were to look at this intelligently, they, I think, could view it as a kind of a very specialized opinion poll. It's not just the media elite that's interested in this. I think that editors are reflecting their understanding of genuine public concerns. Mm-hmm. It's an issue that isn't going to go away.
Have you received any feedback from the officials in the U.S. State Department in recent days or weeks?
No, I haven't had official communication with them other than to process my resignation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've never called you, never asked you why? None of that. Can I read to you a few quotes that you're credited with, statements that you're credited with making, and ask you kind of what you meant by it when you said it. One of the statements was, "What is going on in Bosnia is genocide, and the U.S. has a moral obligation to stop it." Can you tell us what you meant by that?
Well, to me, it seems that if you add up what Serbs are doing in Bosnia, it is genocide. The Serbs are systematically eradicating every trace of what used to be Bosnian society, trying to fragment parts of it to incorporate Serbian elements of the former Bosnia into what they want as a larger Serbia. In the process, Serbs are killing tens of thousands of people, putting tens of thousands of people in concentration camps. I believe that unless the conflict is managed, is brought under control, that the Serbs will continue what they're doing, and I believe several 100,000 Bosnians will die. It's something that is not on the same scale now as the Holocaust, but it's remarkably similar to the beginnings of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do something, by the time this is over, proportionately, it will be as great a disaster for the Bosnians as the Holocaust was for the Jews. Reading the Genocide Convention, I think that you can define this as genocide. Talking to lawyers who specialize in international law, I think you can find agreement that it is genocide. I understand, however, that there are some groups that don't want to call it genocide. Some Jewish organizations, some Armenians, some others feel that this term is so special and unique that it should not be applied to just any circumstance, that would devalue its meaning in a sense. But I think it is quite appropriate, and I would note that the German foreign minister has described what's going on in Bosnia as genocide. I think it would help sharpen our understanding of the problem and our obligation to do something about it if we were to describe it this way. But however you describe it, as long as you understand the details of what's going on, clearly it's a very horrible situation. It's difficult, though, in the United States to grasp fully the extent of this problem. We lead pretty normal lives here. Go home, go to bed, go shopping, go to work, take public transportation. We have no way of conceiving what it is to be in a bomb shelter for weeks at a time, or to have your family killed. It's something that is so radically different from what we experience that it doesn't seem real to us. So I think it's very important to continue to get the story out, to have television pictures of what's going on, to have accounts from reporters in Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo, to remind us exactly what's going on.
Another quote from the New York Times, and it says, they credit you with saying that the risks of a Vietnam quagmire in Yugoslavia are vastly overblown. What did you mean by that?
It seems to me that we have a whole lot of options that fall in between the range of doing nothing on the one hand and sending in the entire U.S. armed forces on the other hand. I think that it's extremely unhelpful for senior administration officials, such as the acting secretary, Mr. Eagleburger, to say that any U.S. involvement would require a Vietnam-style action. There are some people in the Pentagon who insist on thinking that in order to resolve the conflict, you would have to occupy a lot of territory. If you start from that assumption, then yes, you can make up all kinds of scenarios of having 100, 200, 300,000 troops in the former Yugoslavia. But I would not recommend sending in any Western ground forces. I think that we can do a great deal through the air in fact, the way that I analyze this problem is very simple. You have, on the one hand, a very well-armed aggressor surrounded by not very well-armed states. The aggressor wants to take part of those states, faces no opposition, and is going to go ahead and take what he wants. But if you set up a credible deterrent, if you effectively disarm each side by having an equal balance of forces on each side, that then you can control the fighting. So it seems to me that if you balance out, for example, the forces in Bosnia, you put an air cover over Bosnia, that is, you prevent Serbian warplanes from bombing cities, prevent them from bombing cities in Croatia. If you tell the Serbs, look, you've agreed to put your artillery under UN observation, you've agreed not to use it, we're going to hold you to that. If you start indiscriminately shelling civilian areas, then we'll target your artillery. We have the capability, the United States, Western governments, to destroy a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it. We could also tell the Serbians they're not allowed to bring further military supplies into areas that they occupy in Bosnia or in Croatia. Again, we couldn't get all of that, but we could interdict a lot of it. Furthermore, I would say with regard to Bosnia, and then also a little separate issue with Croatia, but particularly with regard to Bosnia, that we should arm the Bosnians. We should lift the arms embargo for the whole region first. That was a clear mistake, a terrible mistake.
Would that include lifting the arms embargo against the Serbians also?
No, I'm sorry. I mean of those states that have been attacked. I think that we should arm the Bosnians, train them. It's difficult to use heavy weapons unless you have training. They don't have the weapons, they don't have the training. But I'm sure that they could learn pretty quickly. I think that the Serbian forces who are on the ground are really not that capable. They're kind of cowardly, in fact. They don't engage in normal military activities. They prefer to sit outside of towns and shell them. And from what I can see, when they are attacked in force, they tend to retreat, or they don't do very well in defending themselves. I think that the Bosnians could recover a great portion of Bosnia if we help them to do so. I think that they have the right to do that. With regard to Croatia, it's a little more complicated because there's a UN ceasefire zone. I'm not sure whether I would agree with the way that this UN ceasefire is being worked out. It would be not in Croatia's long-term interest, not in the West's long-term interest for Serbia to try to control through UN cover those areas that it occupies in Croatia. In some ways, at this point, I think that a credible threat against the Serbs might be the appropriate thing to do to get them to give up those areas that they hold in Croatia. That's certainly the case in Bosnia. But the West can do all of these things at very little cost. Arming and training, that doesn't cost much. Air cover, air support. I don't think that the Serbian military can pose much of a threat to Western military forces. So we can do these things. We can contain the conflict. We should be making these kinds of threats against Serbia, particularly to keep the conflict from spreading to Kosovo. There, I'm convinced if we don't intervene in Bosnia, the Serbs will move in, massacre Albanians in Kosovo, drive a lot out to Albania, and there the Serbs can use aircraft with impunity. They know, here's a village, it's 100% Albanian, just wipe it off the map, use cluster bombs, do whatever. We certainly should be telling the Serbians now, we won't allow you to use your aircraft that way. And we could be threatening them also. Unless you cooperate with the peace process, do these other military measures, but tell them, we intend to support Kosovo and would consider arming, doing other things if you begin aggression there as well. That's the kind of approach that Belgrade is going to listen to. And I think that they would listen very carefully. I'm sure that the generals who support Milosevic now reason correctly that the West isn't going to do anything, therefore they might as well support Milosevic. There isn't an alternative. But if the West were to get involved to say, you may lose your military capability now and for a long time to come, I think those generals would reconsider their support. You could force a political change. The psychological effect alone would be tremendous. So that's the approach that I've been recommending, and it's a sensible one. There are a lot of people who support it here in the United States, intellectuals now I'm talking about, and it's very interesting to see where people who are on all sides of the political spectrum come together over this. People who are very much on the left, very much on the right politically. You can have people as diverse as Anthony Lewis, the New York Times columnist who's quite liberal, and Jean Kirkpatrick, herself a columnist, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, and very conservative, will agree.
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher, Richard Nixon, many others. It would be worth taking a look just at how it is that all of these different people can come together on this issue. But I think that the administration is really out of step with a carefully reasoned approach to the problem. The administration has concluded for the wrong kinds of reasons, for political reasons, that it has no interest in the area. But in fact, there are interests. There are moral interests, which I believe are the most important ones. But even if there were no moral interests involved, there are very important traditional geopolitical strategic interests. The United States cannot afford to have all of the Balkans in a war involving NATO countries, destabilizing Europe, setting an example for other areas in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. It's a danger that is so great that the administration, even if it didn't care about the people at all in the former Yugoslavia, has a responsibility to deal with.
You're also reported as saying that the Bush administration mistakenly believes that the American public really doesn't care too much about what goes on in Bosnia or in Croatia, and that it's someplace that's far removed. Do you think that they still hold that belief that the American people really don't care?
I think the administration does, but I think that the administration is very wrong. It's true, as I said, most Americans couldn't find Yugoslavia on a map. But when you see pictures of men who have been starved to where there are skeletons, or you see pictures of bodies floating in a river, or little children who have been shredded to pieces by explosions, people do react to that, and they react very strongly. My sense of it is, and I may be wrong, but my sense of it is that this is beginning to enter American popular culture as an example of the kinds of things that go wrong in the world, and as something that the United States could and should deal with. You know, it's interesting. This conflict is very, very typical of the kinds of conflicts we will now encounter in the post-Cold War world. In fact, it may be the archetypical case of such conflicts. And I would wonder what would have happened if the order of things had been reversed. Instead of having the Gulf War first, we had Yugoslavia first. How would we have dealt with it then? I think it would have been much more clear what kinds of interests are at stake. U.S. leadership is on the line here. If we stand back from this crisis and let it, in the president's words, burn itself out, or I forget exactly how he described it. I think he described it as a hiccup once after the CSCE summit. Eagleberger said, let it burn itself out. But
Mm-hmm.
if we let that happen, I think it would be very, very difficult for a long time for the United States to exercise real-world leadership, to have a role in Europe, or to have a significant role elsewhere.
One thing that confuses me is the idea that the American government and many journalists have that the war against Croatia and Bosnia-Hercegovina is an ethnic war, some war of age-old ethnic hatreds that has come to the surface after festering for a prolonged period of time. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that that war is a war of ethnic conflicts, age-old ethnic hatreds, or is it possibly a war against those seeking independence by those who wish to expand their borders?
Well, you've described something that is very, very puzzling. A lot of Americans who should know better have, for whatever reasons, come to see this as a kind of an ethnic conflict. It's simply not. It's outright aggression. The Serbians started this from the very beginning. Go back and look at Josic's Ethnic Power Memorandum, Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1987, I think. If Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia wanted to be independent, it wasn't because they wanted to destroy the old Yugoslavia, it's because they wanted security from Serbia. There shouldn't be any question that it's Serbian ethnic nationalism that's the force behind all of this conflict. And it's very misleading. I know that there are senior administration officials who will describe it just in those terms as an ethnic conflict. You can't sort the sides out and so forth. I don't see that at all. If Belgrade had not started the aggression, sure, there would have been low-level conflicts, some conflicts along ethnic lines. But as well as I understand the situation, and again, I'm not a Yugoslav expert, you would have plenty of people more than happy to live together. Croats, Serbs, Muslims, people intermarry. Just look at Sarajevo. It's a city that had a history, contrary to the ethnic war theory, of great tolerance. No, this is a problem for me because a lot of Americans ask that question, and they tend to rely on, one, what U.S. administration officials say, and then two, what the Serbian government says. Unfortunately, I think the longer this goes on, the more the sides, at least in Bosnia, will tend to divide along ethnic lines. If we could have sorted this out a year ago, it would have been fairly easy. It's pretty difficult now to sort it out. Mm-hmm. If we wait a year, well, the Bosnian Muslims will become more radicalized. There's no doubt about that. They'll be mad. I would, if I were in their position, I would be furious.
Right. You can imagine what would happen if 70% of the United States was taken over by, let's say, Mexico, and people were being butchered in the other 70% of the country. It would, the remaining 30% of the American population would be extremely angry, just to put it mildly.
Yes, that's right.
I think also one thing that disputes this idea of ethnic hatreds is just the fact that if you just look at the capital of Croatia, which is Zagreb, they have 60,000 Serbs who are living peacefully with Croatian people, even today, even after the war.
Don't want to go back to Serbia.
Don't want to go back to Serbia, feel that they're part of Croatia, and there is no conflict between those Serbs and those Croatians. So that, together with the fact that the war is occurring all within the borders of Bosnia and all within the borders of Croatia, and none of it is occurring within the borders of Serbia, certainly it must be clear to people who really analyze the situation that it's not a war of ethnic hatred, and that it's a war of aggression and a war of resistance against the aggression.
Exactly right. You say it should be clear to people who analyze the situation. I want to make it very clear. I'm not speaking just for myself. At the working level in the State Department, every analyst, every person who works on Yugoslavia as a full-time occupation will agree with that point, that it's not a civil war, that it's aggression. So it is difficult to understand how senior officials could misrepresent the conflict that way.
And then if you even look a little farther back, the way the Serbian government absorbed the independent, or not the independent, but the autonomous regions of Kosovo and Vojvodina just a few years ago, which is in fact one of the reasons why Croatia began standing up and demanding independence, just for the mere fact that that was a signal
Absolutely.
to Croatian people, and it should have been a signal to the Western government.
Of course it was.
That this was the intent of the Serbian government. That
Very much should have been, yes. If we had acted back then, we could have resolved this conflict before it really got started. I think that Milosevic was kind of playing poker, at least in the early stages, pushing to see how far he could go.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's ridden ethnic nationalism to a point where he's created a whole structure of people under him that believe in this terrible thing. It's very hard to undermine that. But at an early stage, we could have cut it off, and we didn't.
Well, that leads me into my next question. Do you believe that the Serbian response towards the demands for independence by Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia-Hercegovina would have been different had Secretary of State Jim Baker not voiced his support for a unified Yugoslavia back last year?
Absolutely, I do. Yes, I think that was a mistake. We had not understood sufficiently well how important it is for groups of people to be able to declare their independence as political entities. It's not for the United States to deny groups such independence. I think there's a long-standing resistance, particularly in the case of Yugoslavia within the State Department, to fragmentation. But in general, also the State Department was concerned that a breakup of Yugoslavia could have consequences for the breakup of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And people are very afraid to think, well, where do you draw the line? How far can states break up? Does every community that wants to be a state have the right to become a state? Well, I think that kind of concern is somewhat misplaced. Yes, in the world as it is today, there are a lot of areas all over the globe that want self-determination, but not every city, town, and hamlet. These are problems that you can deal with, and we have to deal with them in new ways. Mm-hmm. But to go back to your question specifically, yes, absolutely. If Baker had sent a signal way early on last year that we supported these republics in becoming new states, that would have made a lot of difference.
I remember last year I was in Osijek at the time that Vukovar finally fell to the Serbian Yugoslav army, and then I saw quite a bit of refugees coming from Vukovar, from Vinkovci, the ones that could escape. And I remember thinking to myself, why don't I hear any kind of condemnation from the United States State Department saying that this was a town of at least 50,000 people that was completely and totally decimated, and the amount of savagery and butchering that was going on in that city is really unbelievable for the Western mentality to really grasp. What was going on in the State Department at that time?
I wasn't there at that time, so I don't know. But I have the same question: why weren't we up in arms about this? It's a troubling question.
The other question regarding the refugees is, I always wonder if the people who are analyzing the situation in the State Department really appreciate what it means when they hear a village has been ethnically cleansed. And I wonder if the people who read the reports realize that when for example, a Croatian city like Vukovar or a village like my family comes from, the Petrinja, is cleansed ethnically, that means that those peasants, in a large number of cases, they're peasants who have lived there probably in the same house for their ancestors or their great-grandfathers built the house. They've lived in the village for centuries. They have not only families who belong to the same village, but have extended families, godparents and what have you. So when their village is ethnically cleansed, it's not like we move from Chicago to Detroit or from Washington to New York. Your whole life is taken away from you when you're pushed out of a village like that, because that is your life. The village is all that you know, and I'm always curious if people who are reading these reports really understand just how deep this goes with, and especially with peasants, but for other city dwellers like the people from Vukovar also.
I think it's very difficult for us to fully grasp that. When I came in to work in the morning, I would have a stack of stuff this high to read, and then throughout the course of the day, I would get a lot more telegrams and memos and a lot of paper. And to sift out of that enormous quantity of paper a sense of the human aspects of this crisis is not easy. I think that I and others who worked on Yugoslavia full-time, I was really not the only full-time person, but that was my job full-time. Other people worked on it nearly full-time as a consequence of their assignments in other areas. But we had some notion, and I don't think we have a full sense of it as you described it. But certainly we had much more of a notion of that than did people at higher levels, assistant secretaries and up, who would get maybe a very little amount of information on a couple of pieces of paper, but then could very easily put the problem off. There are so many problems around the world. Why should they care about this one?
What's your feeling about the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the United Nations on Tuesday?
It's a good step. I think that it wasn't a fully complete kind of action. As I understand the resolution, Yugoslavia can still participate, or the FRY can participate in some UN institutions. I think it should be barred completely from the United Nations. There's a paradox, though. The United States has insisted that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, so-called, self-described, is not the sole successor or continuation of the SFRY. On the other hand, the United States has an embassy in Belgrade, and I'd like to know, what is that embassy doing there? Many times I had to write explanations of that, which, let me tell you, were very difficult to write because nobody could figure out exactly what the wording is. Nobody wants to say what that embassy is doing. It exists in a kind of a gray zone.
You almost have to ask yourself, it's a U.S. embassy to what?
Exactly. We've said that we don't recognize the FRY, but then we don't not recognize it. So what's going on? It seems to me that if we wanted to send a real message to Milosevic and to Belgrade, that we are going to continue opposing him, and through words, that's not going to do the trick. As I've said, through military actions, I think we'll get results. But even to send a signal that we really seriously disapprove of what he's doing, we should close the embassy. By having the embassy there, we're kind of telling him, well, we don't like what you're doing, but we still want to talk to you anyway. It's a very mixed message, and it's very easy and quite logical, quite correct for him to interpret that as, well, the West is not going to really do anything bad to me. Just close the embassy. Bring it back.
The U.S. State Department is reported to be drafting a resolution to establish a commission to investigate Serbian war crimes in Bosnia Hercegovina. The allegations include willful killing, torture of prisoners, abuse of civilians in detention centers, deliberate attacks on non-combatants, wanton devastation and forcible expulsion, and deportation of civilians. Do you think the State Department is finally beginning, perhaps, to get an idea of the severity of the situation when they...
I'm afraid I don't. I think that those are the right words, but really they have to be backed up by intent. I guess I would ask the State Department, if you're serious about this, what are you doing to get the information? Are you simply asking other countries to provide you with a little bit of information? When I was working in the State Department, I had suggested that we send U.S. diplomats out to act in the same kind of capacity as journalists, to go around and investigate camps. Mm-hmm. Well, no one wanted to do that. I think the bottom line is that they don't really want the information. They say, on the one hand, well, the ICRC is in there, the Red Cross. Okay, yeah, the Red Cross goes into camps, but the Red Cross won't tell anybody what it finds. That's the way they work. They go in and they help people, but it's all in secrecy.
And I think according to their own bylaws, they're not allowed to take sides on the issue. They have to be kind of
exactly. Otherwise, they couldn't be effective.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the U.S. government says we don't think that reporters are really credible sources. It's very easy to deny newspaper accounts. It's somewhat less easy to deny film accounts.
Right.
But still, the U.S. government won't accept news media sources, even from veteran reporters. So, if we don't get information elsewhere, the only way we'll get it is to have our own people go in. But until we do that, I don't think that all of these statements are going to mean very much.
Do you think there are people within the American government that are willing to take the chance to go into those areas?
I think so. I think you'd have to ask for volunteers. It'd be very dangerous.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah.
What about the question of repatriations that in the future Croatia and Bosnia Hercegovina may ask for or may demand from the Serbian government or the future Yugoslav government, if there is one? Do you think there would be any opposition to that by the American State Department or the American government?
No, I don't think so.
And what do you think about the UN position on something like that? Do you think there would be opposition, or would they support?
Well, you're getting way ahead of where the conflict is in actuality. It's not sensible to talk about repatriation until you've got a very clear ceasefire, and I don't think that you're going to get a clear ceasefire, as I say, until you've got an even balance of forces on the ground. At that point, you can have meaningful negotiations. If you have force behind negotiations, the negotiations have a chance of working. I don't know in detail how things would work if you could establish a viable ceasefire, but until you get that, negotiations aren't going to produce anything. And to talk about repatriation at this point, I don't think is very practical.
Do I understand you then that you're for airstrikes against Serbian military positions within the borders of Serbia, or are you just calling for airstrikes if they're necessary in the areas that have been taken over by Serbs?
There are a range of options, and I support some. I would support airstrikes against Serbian positions in Bosnia. I would support airstrikes against movement of war material from Serbia to Bosnia. And I would also support the threat of airstrikes against military targets in Serbia. But I wouldn't go to that level of military intervention all at once. I would hold that back in reserve.
Recently, Senator Rudman, who I guess had just returned from a trip, I don't know if he went to Croatia and to Bosnia Herzegovina.
He went to Croatia. I don't think that he went to Bosnia.
But he says that the options that you're talking about, the airstrikes, were not viable. He said that the widespread military action is not necessary now. Why do you think he came to that position?
He was misinformed.
Do you know how long he was there in Croatia?
I don't know. He went with Senator Mitchell, and these senators bring their own perspectives to these things. I don't mean to be flip. I really do think that he was misinformed.
Mm-hmm. The term Yugoslav mafia Is it really common, as common as reports say regarding when people talk about Mr. Eagleburger and Scowcroft and Kissinger?
Kissinger, no, but yeah, generally people will talk about the Belgrade Mafia and people who had served there. Not in a venal sense, but I think that these men may know too much about Yugoslavia. Their knowledge of the history, their knowledge of the people has prevented them from really trying to find a solution. They've acquired a kind of a hopelessness. Even a year ago, Mr. Eagleburger was saying, well, you can't stop the conflict. Let the people fight until they get tired of fighting, and then we'll talk to them. Mm-hmm. That's a very defeatist attitude, and that's not helpful. I don't think that Eagleburger and Scowcroft and others really determined the policy. I think that their inclinations led them in a direction which supported the basic political decision not to get involved. There's an interesting problem there also. Why hasn't there been a kind of institutional corrective within the State Department? With all of the analysts who know about the situation, why wasn't there some mechanism through which senior career officials could say, wait, stop, what we're doing is wrong, it's not going to work, and we're going to get into a lot of trouble? I think that's an important question.
So you think that Eagleburger's personal relationship with leaders in Serbia and Yugoslavia, like Milosevic is one of them that he had a personal relationship with. Do you think that has skewed his thinking towards what has to be done there?
In some ways, I think it has. It's made it more difficult for him to think through the options and easier to step back and not wish to be involved.
Mm-hmm. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to go back to it. When I was in Croatia last year, and I was witnessing the quest for Croatian and well, at that time it was Croatian land by the Serbian Yugoslav army, including ethnic cleansing. I didn't see any real evidence that the Serbs were good fighters, and quite the contrary. Everything I saw only proved that they were actually cowardly in the way that they fought, and they preferred to fight. They had the military advantage, and they preferred to set up military positions either on hills that overlooked villages or in the next village over, and just bombard the village or the city into submission, and then they would go in what they would call cleaning up procedures, and they would just go in with the intention of murdering every civilian animal, cow, pig, chicken that moved. Anything that moved, it was their policy to go in and kill. And I've seen this with my own eyes, so I know that it's true. Why is it that the Pentagon has this idea that if you start a military action against the Serbs, especially in Bosnia and in the eastern portions of Croatia, why does the Pentagon believe that this is only going to escalate the fighting? Because everything that I've seen only shows that really the Serbians don't want to fight, and they only need a reason not to fight, and more than likely they'll leave the area without fighting.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I would comment there, the Pentagon is not unified in its views. At the top, just as in the State Department, there's a kind of a policy direction. In the Pentagon, Powell and others, most senior levels, have decided they don't want to get involved. And so they explain how difficult any kind of military involvement would be. But at the level corresponding to my working level over in the Pentagon, as I understand it, there's a great deal of disagreement about this, deep disagreement, with many uniformed officers and civilian analysts arguing that military intervention would be effective.
Mm-hmm. So there is still, even today, there's a dispute over whether it's the right decision or not. Because I was under the impression that the Pentagon was pretty much opposed to any military intervention in the region?
Well, as an institution, but I've spoken to working level uniformed officers and analysts, and I'm reasonably confident in saying that there are deep disagreements within the Pentagon. That there are people who would support everything that I say and indeed go further.
Mm-hmm. Is it in the national interest of the United States to get involved in either Bosnia Hercegovina or in Croatia and pushing out the Serbian aggressors?
In order to define what our interest is, you have to think about two things. One, objectively, what is the right thing for the United States to do? And then two, politically, what is realistic? I think that you could explain about geopolitical concerns for a long time to the American people, and it's not going to mean anything to them.
Mm-hmm.
Those are real concerns, I would argue, that those are very compelling concerns. A more important concern from my personal point of view, and I think also from a realistic political point of view, is the extent of the violations of every standard of human civilization. There is a fundamental moral and ethical problem. The people who are being attacked in former Yugoslavia do want to have a life like that we have here in the United States. They have values that are very similar to our own. They're trying to be democratic, trying to have free institutions. I think that we have an obligation to support them, and I think that this is an obligation the American people could accept if they're properly informed about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That the concern is there. All you need to do is to bring that concern up. From the geopolitical side, in terms of the traditional American interests in Europe, sure, we have interest in keeping Europe stable. We don't want the Balkans to be engulfed in a war. We have interest in keeping the institutions viable. The CSCE, NATO, the EC, those have all provided stability in the world. If those institutions are incapable of dealing with this crisis, and again, this is a very typical kind of crisis that we will have in the post-Cold War world. This isn't the first and last. It's the first in what may become a series of very similar crises. We can't deal with it here. We're not going to be able to deal with it elsewhere. Those institutions that we rely on will lose their legitimacy. So all of these reasons are compelling. Yeah, the U.S. has a national interest here. I wish I could find the words to really fully articulate the moral dimension of this. It's something that in some ways is very new to us. So we dealt with this a little bit in the aftermath of World War II. We have to try to think through it now. Maybe we don't have the vocabulary, the traditional models to rely on to deal with it. But I think that we need to spend the time to think about it that way.
Do you think that the fact that the United States supplied a great deal of the military arms and equipment and training that the Yugoslav army is now using in order to devastate the civilian population in both Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, does that increase the American obligation to step in at all?
No, I don't see it that way.
No. You think that they would have the obligation to step in regardless if they supplied the military arms and training? Or if they
I just don't see that as a binding kind of responsibility. The Yugoslav army would have built up its forces, whether the U.S. had supplied them arms and training or any other country. That's an interesting point. To my mind, that's not a real reason.
Well, the reason the reason I felt that it was because for two reasons. One is that the United States apparently supplied the arms and training because Yugoslavia, at the time that they were supplied with this material, were considered a buffer zone between the Soviet
Sure.
The Soviet government and the Western governments.
Mm-hmm.
So that military aid and training was given to them for that purpose. So if it wasn't being used for that purpose, it was being used for another purpose, namely to commit crimes against humanity against its own population, then I would think that it would behoove the American government to step in, because the materials wasn't being used for the purpose it was designated to be used for. The second reason why, even if that wasn't true, and if it is true that the people who are using the equipment are renegades, no longer attached to the Yugoslav army whatsoever, but kind of like loose cannons on their own, then it would also behoove the American government, in my opinion, to step in, because again, the material wasn't being used by the people that it was designated for the purpose it was designated for.
I suppose if you had some higher authority and you could take this all to court, you could argue it that way. But in the real world, that's not. How should I say it? That's not a practical consideration, it seems to me. It's certainly not one that the U.S. government ever considers.
Right. Well, we can see that especially in Iraq, because Americans also supplied military equipment to Saddam Hussein, and we see what they've done there.
Logically, I think you're right.
Thanks. Do you think the American policy would be any stronger or any clearer in the event that the Serbians in the next 2 or 3 months invaded Kosovo or the Sanjak region, which is at this time it's looking pretty scary militarily?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I'm afraid that as long as we continue as we're going now, Serbian invasion, well, it's not quite an invasion of Kosovo, they're already there in force, but the beginning of a massacre of Albanians and driving Albanians over the border to Albania, that would cause some reaction, but the U.S. government has been consistently reacting to events. I think unless the basic policy has changed, that we would continue to react. Then we would probably try to put in observers in Macedonia, or we would tell the Albanian government not to get involved, do some foolish thing.
Do you think that they would just be
I don't think
too late and a little?
Yeah, I don't think it would be a trigger for U.S. intervention as such. We wouldn't draw a line in the sand, so to speak. And
what does have to happen before the U.S. really intervenes militarily and strongly tells the Milosevic regime and the Serbian Yugoslav army that this is enough, another step forward, and you're going to face military action?
That's real simple. It's just a political decision in the White House. Once we've got that decision, everything else can be done.
And you think that decision will be based solely on politics, maybe the election?
In this administration, that's right. Yeah.
Do you anticipate any stronger action being taken by the Bush administration if he wins the election in November?
Possibly. I would hope so. I think that the people who are concerned about this, from the grassroots level all the way up to policy analysts in Washington, as I said, of every different variety, are going to continue to make this an issue. If Bush wins re-election, he'll have to deal with it more seriously. But then, the longer you wait to deal with it, the more difficult it will be. In January, it will be much more difficult to deal with than now.
Mm-hmm. Do you plan on returning to the State Department in the future?
No, I don't.
No. You know, I talked to a couple of people before coming here, and they, there's always different opinions, but some of the opinions are that maybe, on the skeptical side, that maybe this is by you resigning from the State Department, you're able to say things unofficially that the State Department can't say officially.
Oh no, no! I did this on my own. I can tell you. It'd be nice if the world worked that way, because then I would have some more guarantee of a job and health insurance and that kind of thing. But no, this was a leap into the dark for me.
They were saying to me that they thought it was along the same lines as what Lawrence Eagleberger did when he
Did he resign?
Well, from what I understand and everything I've read, he resigned in order to take the board of directors job and also to work with Kissinger Associates.
Well, he resigned and then came back in. It wasn't the resignation over principle, or it wasn't the resignation at mid-career.
No, that's true.
I think when he left the department, he had probably 25 years of service, and
but you must have. I mean, here you are. You're a career diplomat. You're in the Foreign Service. That was your chosen career. You must have agonized over that decision to resign.
It was a difficult decision. I come from a family, a Foreign Service family. My father was in the Foreign Service for 35 years.
Oh my gosh.
So it was difficult not only for me but for them. When I told him what I was going to do, he couldn't believe it, and tried to discourage me from doing it. Some of my colleagues were supportive before I resigned, was supportive of the idea that I would resign. Some also tried to discourage me from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But after I made up my mind to resign, it was actually fairly easy. But I still don't know what I'm going to be doing. Mm-hmm. I'll keep talking about this and writing articles for several months, but then after that, I don't know. I'll really have to find a job or have to get a grant that'll keep me in business for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to drive a taxi cab a long time ago.
You can always go back to that. In your opinion, what could Croatian Americans do who live in the United States? What could they do to somehow affect the policy to get public opinion?
Well, I think that they could do a lot, particularly in key states where there are large Croatian communities, in Illinois and Chicago, Indiana, other states that are contested. I don't know how many Croatians are in New Jersey. But if Croatian groups were to organize and to tell the White House very candidly, look, you're doing the wrong thing here, and we're going to make sure that you're accountable for it. The other day I was talking to a woman, Croatian, woman of Croatian ancestry, who was a major campaign contributor to Bush, a big-time campaign contributor. And she was telling me how distressed she was by the administration's approach to this, and how disturbed she was that despite all of her help to the Republicans, that she was not being listened to. I think that the White House will listen, the Republican campaign will listen to organized concern. I've talked to some groups. I'm going out on a tour of the West Coast later in October to talk to a Muslim organization in Los Angeles, and then World Affairs Councils in San Jose and San Francisco and Portland and Seattle. I may go to Cincinnati at some point, and to Chicago also. Going up to New Haven, to something in Yale next week, and a couple of other colleges in this area. There is interest locally if Croatian communities want to organize discussions, public discussions. I'm sure that they could find local international affairs councils to sponsor such activities, to perhaps get news coverage. Those are activities that I would strongly encourage.
Just one last question. Just this week, I think it was, that a Croatian American who just happens to be from the Detroit area, called Mara Letica, has been nominated for the U.S. ambassador to Croatia. Any thoughts about her? What her chances are of getting the committee to approve her?
I really don't know. I don't know her. I don't know her role in the Croatian community here in the United States. So I really can't comment on that.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Kenney. I appreciate giving us this time, and
thank you.
And all the best to you in the future. And I think that on behalf of not only the Croatians in the United States, but Croatians in Croatia, you should be commended for taking action on your principle. And you know, there's not many individuals that would give up a career for their beliefs, and congratulations for having those beliefs.
Well, thank you.